The German sergeant was checking his watch, perhaps anticipating the end of a shift or the arrival of supplies. When the world effectively ended, 200 shells landed at exactly the same instant. There was no warning. There was no distant, ominous rumble of guns firing from miles away. There was no telltale whistle of incoming ordnance, that shrieking sound that usually gave veteran soldiers a split second to brace themselves. 1 second. His men were engaged in the mundane routine of survival, eating cold rations in their foxholes just outside Saint-Lô, lulled into a false sense of security by the quiet afternoon. The next second, the earth erupted in every direction simultaneously. It wasn't just an explosion, it was a geological event. Men who had been standing simply vanished, vaporized in a pink mist or buried under tons of displaced soil. Heavy vehicles were flipped into the air like children's toys. The concussion wave alone was lethal, knocking soldiers unconscious 50 meters from the nearest impact, rupturing internal organs without ever breaking the skin. The survivors who eventually crawled out of the smoking craters weren't just physically wounded, they were psychologically shattered. In the span of a single heartbeat, their entire reality had changed from relative peace to absolute annihilation. There was no buildup, no fighting chance, no opportunity to display courage. German artillery didn't work like this. In fact, nobody's artillery worked like this. They had just experienced something the American army had been quietly perfecting for decades in the dust of Oklahoma. It was a weapon system so devastating, so mathematically precise, that captured German generals would later confess it was worse than anything else they faced in the war. Worse than the swarms of Sherman tanks. Worse than the endless fleets of bombers darkening the skies. Worse even than the ruthless, grinding advance of the Russians in the east. To truly understand why American artillery terrified the German Wehrmacht more than any other weapon, you have to understand the mechanics of how artillery normally worked in the 1940s. In the traditional model of warfare, bombardments were a dialogue. They started with ranging shots. A battery commander would fire 1 or 2 shells, observers would watch where they landed relative to the target, and gunners would manually crank their weapons to adjust the aim. Then, and only then, would the real barrage begin. This process was methodical, accurate, and fatally slow. More importantly, it gave the enemy a warning. The first errant shells told defenders exactly what was coming. It was a signal that said, "You are about to be destroyed." This gave them precious seconds to dive into foxholes, crawl under heavy vehicles, or flatten themselves against the earth to minimize their profile. And those seconds mattered more than anyone realized. The US Army, obsessed with data, conducted brutal studies on how fast soldiers could react to incoming fire. The findings were stark. At the moment of the first impact, 58% of soldiers in a defensive position were typically still standing or exposed. Only 9% were fully prone with protection. But the human survival instinct is fast. Within 2 seconds of the first explosion, those numbers reversed. After 8 seconds, every single living soldier was flat on the ground, utilizing some form of cover. The mathematics of survival were brutal, but clear. A bombardment that gave defenders 8 seconds of warning was statistically 66% less lethal than one that arrived without warning. The question that consumed American artillery officers in the dusty classrooms of the 1930s was simple, yet revolutionary. What if there was no warning at all? What if the physics of flight could be manipulated so that the first sound the enemy heard was their own destruction? The answer came from the windswept hills of Oklahoma. Fort Sill had been the home of American artillery training since 1911. A place where tradition usually reigned supreme. In the years between the world wars, while the rest of the US Army stagnated under budget cuts and isolationism, a handful of visionary officers at Fort Sill were quietly revolutionizing the very concept of indirect fire. Major Carlos Brewer arrived at the gunnery department in the late 1920s with radical ideas that challenged the established doctrine. He believed American artillery was too slow, too cumbersome, and too dependent on outdated methods inherited from the trenches of the First World War. Brewer introduced new fire direction techniques designed to make artillery support almost instantaneous, turning a clumsy bludgeon into a sniper's rifle. His successor, Major Orlando Ward, took the concept even further, introducing an organizational change that would alter the course of history. Ward created something called the Fire Direction Center, FDC. The idea was to centralize the brain of the artillery. Instead of each battery calculating its own firing solutions independently, a recipe for chaos and delay, a central headquarters would coordinate all the guns in a sector simultaneously. The implications were revolutionary. If one headquarters controlled dozens of guns, and if the calculations could be done fast enough by a team of specialists, every gun could fire at a different time, yet achieve a singular result. This was the birth of the time on target taught concept. The logic was elegant, but the execution was murderously complex. It required a level of mathematical precision that was almost impossible without modern computers. Every artillery shell follows a ballistic arc, a curve determined by physics, gravity, and wind. A 105mm howitzer located 3 miles from the target might have a shell flight time of 4 or 5 seconds. A larger 155mm gun positioned 5 miles away might take 60 seconds. A massive, distant 8-inch howitzer could take 90 seconds or more to deliver its payload. To achieve a TOT barrage, the FDC had to calculate the exact flight time from every gun position to the specific target coordinates. Then, they had to work backward. If the impact time was set for 12 hours, the 8-inch gun had to fire at 11 hours 58 minutes and 30 seconds. The 155mm had to fire at 11 hours 59 minutes. The 105mm had to fire at 11 hours 59 minutes and 15 seconds. The countdown went out over the radio, synchronizing the violence. Fire direction centers broadcast the time hack to every battery in the sector. Gunners stood by their lanyards, listening with stopwatches, sweating as the seconds ticked down. At the designated moment, the distant heavy guns fired first, their deep booms rolling across the landscape. Seconds later, the medium batteries opened up. Finally, the closest guns added their shells to the converging storm. The target heard nothing. The shells from the distant guns were flying high in the stratosphere, silently racing the shells from the closer guns. For a German soldier on the receiving end, it was inexplicable. You hear a bird chirping. You hear the wind in the trees. You feel safe. And then, in a fraction of a second, the sky falls. Everything explodes at once. American officers quickly learned that the psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. German prisoners consistently reported this same trauma. The silence before a TOT barrage was the most terrifying part of the war. It created a constant state of paranoia. The Germans could do the math. They were excellent engineers. Any competent artilleryman understood ballistic calculations. What they couldn't match was the speed and the network. Under the German system, an attack from an unexpected direction could expect to be free from accurate artillery fire for 10 to 12 minutes. That was how long it took German batteries to receive targeting information via telephone, calculate firing solutions manually, and physically adjust their guns. American artillery could respond in under 3 minutes. This difference wasn't just about math, it was about technology and doctrine working in perfect harmony. General Jacob Devers, a pioneer of armored warfare, had observed the FM radios that Connecticut State Police used in their patrol cars to coordinate intercepts. He realized that this civilian technology held the key to modern war. He convinced the Army to develop rugged FM vehicle radios for forward observers. The result was clear: static-free communication from the front lines to the fire direction centers, even while units were moving at full speed. The contrast was stark. German forward observers had to rely on telephone lines that were constantly being cut by shellfire or run over by tanks. When the wires were cut, the guns went silent. American observers rode with the infantry in jeeps and tanks, calling in coordinates by radio in real time. By 1944, an American infantry company under attack could have devastating artillery support raining down within 3 minutes of the first shot. The Germans needed 12 minutes for the same response. Those 9 extra minutes were an eternity in combat. They cost thousands of German lives and saved thousands of Americans. The gap between American and German artillery wasn't just about tactics, it was a clash between two different centuries. While American batteries hummed with the sound of diesel engines and crackled with radio chatter, the German artillery columns still clattered with the sound of horses' hooves. They were fighting a modern, mechanized war with Napoleonic logistics. Worse, the German war machine was cannibalizing itself. General Hans Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, wrote despairingly that his artillery included guns from every major power in Europe. He had French 75 seconds, Czech howitzers, Polish field guns, and Soviet pieces captured on the Eastern Front. This diversity was a logistical nightmare. Each gun required different ammunition, different firing tables, different spare parts, and different maintenance procedures. Some batteries sat silent in the heat of battle because the correct shells hadn't arrived, or the wrong caliber had been delivered. The Americans, by contrast, fielded a standardized family of guns with abundant interchangeable ammunition and pre-computed firing solutions for every conceivable situation. At Normandy, the British alone had 6 times as many guns as Eberbach could deploy. The Americans had even more. German officers understood they were outgunned. What they didn't understand, not until they experienced it, was how completely the Americans had mastered the science of coordinated fire. The American artillery system received its first true combat test in the harsh deserts of North Africa in late 1942. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was impressed despite himself. In a letter to his wife dated February 18, 1943, he described the fighting during the initial clashes in Tunisia with a mix of respect and frustration. An observation plane had directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone, Rommel wrote. He noted that the Americans were calling in accurate fire faster than his own forces could respond. Rommel had fought the British for 2 years. He knew what Allied artillery could do, but the American system was something different. It wasn't just the sheer volume of fire, though the Americans certainly had that in abundance. It was the coordination. Multiple batteries converging on single targets with precision timing, creating a kill zone from which there was no escape. The American forces at Kasserine Pass were green. They made rookie mistakes and some units broke under the ferocity of the German attack, but the artillery never failed them. Even when infantry positions were overrun, the guns kept firing, covering the retreat. German advances stalled under curtains of steel that seemed to appear from nowhere. Rommel's veterans noticed. They started respecting American artillery long before they respected American infantry. By June 1944, the American artillery system had been refined into a ruthless killing machine. The Normandy hedgerows, the bocage, should have been a defensive paradise for the Germans. Each field was surrounded by ancient earthen berms topped with dense, tangled vegetation. These were natural fortresses, perfect cover for defenders and perfect death traps for attackers. American infantry struggled in the bocage. Tanks couldn't break through the hedgerows without exposing their weak underbellies. Progress was measured in yards per day, paid for in blood, but the artillery never stopped learning. Forward observers developed techniques for calling fire into positions they couldn't directly see, using sound and map coordinates. Spotter planes, the grasshoppers, circled overhead like hawks, directing batteries onto German concentrations behind the berms. At Hill 192 outside St. Lo, the 2nd Infantry Division faced entrenched German defenders who had repulsed every previous attack. The division artillery commander decided to try psychological warfare through firepower. He coordinated 20 separate TOT missions in a single night. Every few hours, random German positions that seemed safe erupted in simultaneous explosions. The defenders couldn't sleep. They couldn't resupply. They couldn't rotate their exhausted men to rear positions because the rear positions were getting hit too. By morning, German resistance had crumbled not just from casualties, but from exhaustion and terror. The psychological effect had been as important as the high explosives. On July 25, 1944, the American Army demonstrated what happened when air power and artillery worked together in perfect coordination. Operation Cobra was designed to break the Normandy stalemate once and for all. General Omar Bradley wanted overwhelming force concentrated on a narrow front. The bombardment began at 9:38 inches the morning. Over 1,500 heavy bombers dropped their loads on German positions west of St. Lo. Medium bombers followed. Then, fighter bombers swooped in. Finally, as the smoke cleared, the artillery took over to pin down any survivors. More than 1,100 guns opened fire simultaneously. Over 140,000 shells had been allocated for 7 Corps alone. The Germans holding that sector ceased to exist as a fighting force. General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the elite Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best armored units in the German army. His men were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. They had survived Soviet artillery barrages and British bombing raids. Nothing had prepared them for this. Bayerlein's after-action report described the combined devastation in language that shocked even hardened staff officers. The bomb carpets rolled toward them, most passing only a few yards away, he wrote. A pall of dust rose with fountains of earth spewing high in the air. The whole area looked like a moonscape. Everything was burned and destroyed. His tanks were overturned by the blast waves. His communication lines were severed instantly. His command posts were demolished. But the physical destruction wasn't what broke his men. It was the helplessness. The survivors behaved like lunatics, Bayerlein reported. They were found shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak or hold a weapon. In my opinion, hell is not as bad as what we experienced. A German general who had fought across Europe for 5 years wasn't comparing the battle to the Russian front, he was comparing it to damnation. The Panzer Lehr Division, the elite armored formation that had been expected to throw the Americans back into the sea, lost nearly half its combat strength in a single morning. And Operation Cobra was just the beginning. The German line didn't just bend, it shattered. American armor poured through the gap. Within days, General Patton's Third Army was racing across France, covering distances that seemed impossible. German units trying to retreat found themselves under constant artillery harassment. American forward observers rode with the lead elements, calling in fire on any concentration of enemy troops or vehicles. The advance was so fast that artillery battalions had to leapfrog positions just to keep up, a complex ballet of movement and fire. But the fire direction system was designed for exactly this kind of chaos. Batteries could displace, set up, and register new firing solutions within minutes. German defenders trying to establish blocking positions discovered that American shells arrived before they could even dig in. The artillery seemed to be everywhere at once. By August, the German army in France was in full retreat. Entire divisions were destroyed in the Falaise pocket, caught in a crossfire of artillery from multiple directions. The survivors carried stories back to Germany, spreading the fear. American guns fired without warning, and the shells arrived from nowhere. In December 1944, American artillery became even more terrifying with the introduction of a secret weapon. The proximity fuse, known to soldiers as the funny fuse or the VT fuse, had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, second only to the atomic bomb. The Pentagon had refused to allow its use in ground combat for fear the Germans might recover an unexploded shell and reverse engineer the technology. But when Germany launched its desperate, massive offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, General Eisenhower demanded permission to use every weapon available to stop the breakthrough. The VT fuse contained a tiny radar transmitter in the nose of the shell. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground, the shell detonated automatically when it sensed it was close to the Earth, typically 20 to 50 feet in the air. An airburst shell was devastating against troops in the open. Shrapnel rained down from above, penetrating foxholes and trenches that would have protected soldiers against ground-level explosions. Combined with TOT tactics, the proximity fuse turned American artillery into something almost supernatural. German soldiers who thought they were safe in their fighting positions suddenly found death falling from the sky with no warning at all. There was literally nowhere to hide. The Battle of the Bulge became the ultimate test of American artillery. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops smashed into weakly held American positions in the Ardennes forest. The attack achieved complete surprise. German armor penetrated deep into Allied lines, creating confusion and panic. But the artillery held the line. At Dom-Buchenbach, on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, German forces were breaking through. The 2nd Infantry Division faced annihilation. American artillery came to the rescue, with well-placed targeting of over 10,000 rounds in an 8-hour period. For the frozen, terrified American GIs, huddling in their foxholes, that distant thunder wasn't just noise. It was the sound of salvation. It was the only thing standing between them and a massacre. The German advance stopped cold. On the northern shoulder, 4 American divisions coordinated their artillery under a single command. 348 guns, plus a battalion of 4 2-inch mortars, all fired together, their shells directed by one fire direction center. Units that had successfully broken through American infantry positions found themselves shredded by converging artillery fire. And then, the proximity fuses arrived. General George Patton was not easily impressed by weapons. He believed in aggressive tactics, mobile warfare, and the spirit of the bayonet. He generally disliked the idea of sitting back and letting artillery do the work. The proximity fuse changed his mind completely. In a letter to the War Department, Patton described what happened when his guns caught a German battalion in the open. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," Patton wrote. "We caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River and killed by actual count 702. Actual count, not an estimate. After the smoke cleared, soldiers had to walk the field and count the bodies one by one. A single artillery concentration had wiped out an entire German battalion. Over 700 men killed in minutes." Patton continued his letter with an observation that revealed how much the new weapon had impressed him. "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." Coming from Patton, who believed in charging forward, not waiting for technology, this was extraordinary praise. He concluded simply, "I am glad that you all thought of it first." The psychological effect of VT-fused TOT barrages pushed German soldiers past their breaking point. At Malmedy, American artillery battalions supporting the town fired proximity-fused shells against attacking German formations. The defenders watched in disbelief at what happened next. German soldiers charged directly into the artillery fire, screaming "Kamerad!" the German word for surrender. Think about the level of terror required to make a soldier run times toward times the enemy lines. It wasn't a tactical decision. It was primal panic. It was a desperate need to be anywhere else but under those airbursts. When interrogators asked survivors of the Bulge what they feared most, the answer was consistent. It wasn't the bitter cold. It wasn't Patton's tanks. It was the airbursts. After the war, American intelligence officers systematically interviewed German commanders about their experiences. The testimony was consistent. German officers who had been critical of American infantry, often calling them enthusiastic amateurs who relied too heavily on firepower rather than maneuver, had nothing but respect and fear for American artillery. The German perspective revealed something important about the clash of doctrines. When German units came under attack, the British would usually return fire and then maneuver to a better position. The Americans responded differently. Instead of maneuvering, they simply smothered the area with a punishing rain of steel. Once the barrage ended, they counterattacked before the Germans could even lift their heads. This pattern of immediate, overwhelming violence shattered German defensive doctrine. They were trained to absorb an initial assault and then counterattack. American artillery denied them the opportunity to organize that counterattack. One captured German officer summarized the difference perfectly. He noted that the British would fire, then pause to adjust. The Americans, he complained, simply fired everyone, everything, and all at once. By March 1945, American artillery had achieved something unprecedented in military history. At the Rhine crossing, Generals Simpson and Eisenhower stood on the West Bank and watched as 2,070 guns opened fire simultaneously. It was a display of industrial might that the world had never seen. Over 60,000 shells were fired in a single hour. It was the largest TOT barrage of the war. The German positions on the far bank didn't just take casualties, they were erased from the map. When the smoke cleared, American infantry crossed the river with minimal opposition. The defenders who survived were too stunned, too deafened, and too traumatized to fight. Patton later wrote in his memoirs that the artillery had won the war. The time-on-target technique didn't win the war by itself, no single weapon ever does. But it represented something important about how the American military approached warfare. While other armies relied on individual courage, warrior spirit, and tactical improvisation, American officers at Fort Sill spent the interwar years solving the problems of death with mathematics and engineering. They asked a simple, cold question: how do we kill more of the enemy while losing fewer of our own men? The answer wasn't romantic. It was coordination, speed, and overwhelming firepower delivered with precision timing. It was a solution born of slide rules, radio waves, and logistics. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make for heroic stories of individual courage charging machine gun nests, but it worked. German soldiers who faced American artillery in France, Belgium, and Germany carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They remembered the silence before the storm, the instant when the world exploded, the helplessness of knowing that nothing they did, no skill, no bravery, no fortification could protect them. General Behrlein spoke for all of them when he said, "Hell is not as bad as what we experienced." The men who perfected TOT at Fort Sill never became famous. They fought their war with slide rules and stopwatches years before the first shot was fired in anger. They weren't looking for glory. They were looking for a mathematical way to bring American boys home alive. And the soldiers who survived the frozen hell of the Bulge or the hedgerows of Normandy because of a sudden, thunderous curtain of steel knew exactly who had saved them. In the end, the American victory was a triumph of system over individual heroism, a realization that in modern war, the side that controls the seconds controls the outcome.